Big news, everyone. Lock and Code is up for a Webby Award. Once called the Oscars of the Internet, the Webbies have nominated Lock and Code in the Best Branded Podcast or Segment category. And you can help. Please vote for Lock and Code to earn the People's Voice Award. You can click the link at the top of the episode description in your podcast app, follow the account creation instructions, and log your vote. Thank you.
This mass proliferation of targets, it just accelerates the speed of destruction and the intensity of destruction of warfare. And it doesn't necessarily give you any kind of military or political advantage.
This is Lock and Code, a Malwarebytes podcast. I'm your host, David Ruiz. Our main story today is about killer robots. And while that sounds salacious, we are talking today about robots that can kill us. It isn't science fiction, it isn't some far-off techno-dystopia. It is, for many parts of the world, a reality taking place in the sky. But it starts down here. In late February, the artificial intelligence developer Anthropic drew a line in the sand. The AI company publicly stated that it could not come to an agreement with the Department of Defense over how its technology would be used by the US government. This was interesting because Anthropic had already deployed some of its models into and across the US government. Anthropic's large language model, called Claude, was already in use by the Department of Defense and other national security agencies. And according to Anthropic, it was used for, quote, mission-critical applications such as intelligence analysis, modeling and simulation, operational planning, cyber operations, and more, end quote. So, if that was okay, what wasn't? According to a great deal of reporting, the US Department of Defense wanted Anthropic to agree that its technology be able to be used for what it called, quote, any lawful use, end quote. And for the most part, Anthropic was okay with that, except for two major uses: mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons. Expanding a bit on that, Anthropic would not allow the US Department of Defense, which now calls itself the Department of War, to use the company's tech to help spy on Americans en masse or to help kill people without people being involved. As Anthropic said in its statement, quote, frontier AI systems are simply not reliable enough to power fully autonomous weapons. We will not knowingly provide a product that puts America's warfighters and civilians at risk. We have offered to work directly with the Department of War on R&D to improve the reliability of these systems, but they have not accepted this offer. In addition, without proper oversight, fully autonomous weapons cannot be relied upon to exercise the critical judgment that our highly trained professional troops exhibit every day. They need to be deployed with proper guardrails, which don't exist today, end quote. Now, before anyone praises Anthropic here, I want to clarify that the company's position isn't one against killer robots, full stop. In the same statement I just quoted, Anthropic also wrote, quote, partially autonomous weapons like those used today in Ukraine are vital to the defense of democracy. Even fully autonomous weapons, those that take humans out of the loop entirely and automate selecting and engaging targets, may prove critical for our national defense, end quote. There's a remarkable amount of soft language in this debate, like Anthropic's reference to a system that can automate selecting and engaging targets, which removes the reality of what that describes: killing people. Plainly spoken, this is a fight about AI systems that can choose people to kill, that can enable drones to kill those people, and that, as a consequence, can reduce the number of people who can be held accountable for that killing afterwards. Today, to help us understand the fight against fully autonomous weapons, how close we are to dystopia, and what we can do ourselves, we're speaking with Peter Asaro, chair of the campaign to stop killer robots. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are excited to have you here. We have a ton to talk about, so I just want to dive into it. I want to start the episode with a really basic question, which is just what is a killer robot? Because I think, right, like 10 years ago, people probably believed it was a Boston Dynamics robot run amok or even like a Terminator type machine. So what instead is the reality today? What is a killer robot?
Yeah, well, it took us many years to convince journalists not to use an image of the Terminator every time they did an article about us. It was there in your introduction where it's the working definition that we've been using at the United Nations to try to develop language for a treaty on autonomous weapons are systems that, without further human input, select and engage targets. Now, the debate, they're kind of expanding that to identify, select, and engage targets. Typically, we think of a robot, a sort of soldier or something like that. More realistically, and really what we were envisioning more when we started, or sort of more like UAVs that are not remotely piloted, but are just autonomously flying around and selecting targets. And we've seen that sort of technology continue to evolve quite rapidly in the last year or two, in the Ukraine conflict in particular. But of course, many of these military systems are really broadly distributed. There's sensors, surveillance technologies, and we're seeing now, of course, more and more artificial intelligence being used for identifying targets that then go to humans who then send some missile from any number of different platforms to destroy a target. But AI is sort of in that process of targeting. But really, for an autonomous weapon, it has the authority to select and engage targets without human intervention. And that's, I think, a pretty clear boundary that we can actually regulate pretty effectively with an international treaty, at least as far as establishing norms around humans being fundamentally in control. And there's, complex borderline cases, mostly like missile defense systems that do certain forms of automatic targeting and engagement, but are directly under human supervision at all times. And that seems like a reasonable application. So it becomes this question of, what does it mean for a human to meaningfully control these automated systems?
You were saying there that especially in the war in Ukraine, there's been a ton of advancement in these types of systems that have like surveillance capabilities. They may have facial recognition tools like on board. I just wanted to ask, tell me more about that. What does it look like today? Is it a drone? Is it a plane-like thing? We kind of talked about how it's not a humanoid automaton. So what is the actual shape? What is it capable of?
Yeah, so most of the systems that are being developed and deployed in Ukraine, and there's a number of companies, both Ukrainian companies and EU companies outside of Ukraine, and as well as Silicon Valley companies that have developed these drones. Mostly they're the sort of quad rotor style drones, but there are also winged versions of these. And they have different sort of applications and payloads and things on ranges in particular. Winged things can go a lot further. Because Ukraine is fighting a sophisticated adversary like Russia that has electronic jamming capabilities, the typical approach of simply flying by remote control, which uses electromagnetic, radio signals to control the aircraft and just pick a target and fly into a target, the jamming equipment will prevent that communications link from working. Typically, the ones that are deployed are fairly short range. They might be, mounted on a vehicle and have like 100 meters effective radius of jamming. So you can sort of get close, but you can't do that sort of final descent and attack. So what they've developed is something called a pixel lock kind of technology where human operators will fly it up to, 150 meters or so, and then take a photograph essentially of the target, or draw a box around some pixels on the screen that represent the target they want to destroy, a tank or a soldier or what have you, and then assign that target to the device, and then the device will autonomously sort of fly into that target even if it is jammed and you lose connection with it. and it'll maneuver continuously, till it runs out of battery trying to do that. That's one sort of technology. The other thing is that because, again, of jamming and some of the longer range jamming, especially if you fly into, Russian territory, for long range strikes, they've developed a lot of visual navigation systems, VPS, because GPS, that we're more familiar with from our cell phones and such, uses satellite communications to triangulate your location on the surface of the Earth. And those are electromagnetic waves, and those can also be jammed. So GPS doesn't work in those, what they call sort of denied areas, right? So if you do take a bunch of imagery from satellites and from other sources of where you want the drone to go, you can pre-program it with a sort of path through that sort of visual space. And it can use these, visual landmarks and things to navigate. And they can do this over long distances of hundreds of miles and target bases and oil refineries and things deep into Russia. And then you start seeing like all of these different technologies are sort of piecemeal occurring. And even when we started the campaign more than a decade ago, the technology is there to do fully autonomous targeting. It's really the social norms and the legal norms around, like, is that safe? Should we do that? That's really holding back the use of these technologies. But as they develop more expertise and more confidence and new applications, they're sort of getting bolder in terms of automating more and more of what they call the kill chain, the sort of decision cycle and the control of weapon systems from, some central command out to the field.
It's funny because I was going to ask, right? My next question was like, are the technologies here? And everything you listed is saying, yes, the technology is absolutely here. And it was this fun kind of question of like, oh, are we right around the corner? Is it going to happen? If this last piece of technology is created, is it the actual materiality of that software existing? And it sounds like, no, that's already here. It kind of feels like when we talk about like the climate crisis, right? Like, oh, are we going to cross the threshold? Yeah, we crossed it.
Yeah.
Like, it's now just mitigation. And you were saying here, what actually prevents us from deploying these things is the social norm, the conversation, the question of, should this be something we're doing? Help me understand that debate. Like, who is, obviously the campaign to stop killer robots is pushing back on this. Who else is involved here? I just would love to know who's fighting, who's not fighting, and what are the statements being made other than the very simple, hey, we shouldn't do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been, I would say, more nuanced. And again, like these technologies were available, I would say, 10 years ago, but they weren't put together in this way and they weren't being developed as a specific military application. And there were certainly companies and projects being developed in that direction, and that continues, right? So the conversation has been happening and people have been sort of like, should we do this and should we not? And even when you read journalistic reports of the people who are building these systems currently in Ukraine, they're sort of acknowledging that they're opening a Pandora's box and they wonder about the long-term effects and the morality of it all. But at the same time, they're trying to defend their country. And so they're doing whatever they can to do that. But I think the more sort of deliberative part of this, of course, civil society has been talking about this, and we're a group of academics, my organization, who are sort of part of this coalition trying to get a treaty at the UN, have been talking about these things for a while. And certainly the military has also been talking about this. And I would say honestly that for much of the last decade or two, like, it's been the military leadership that are very hesitant to adopt these kinds of systems for various kinds of reasons, but primarily because they're responsible for whatever these systems do. And it's not clear that these systems can go out and do, what they want them to do in a predictable and reliable way, that they're willing to take responsibility for whatever happens when you send it out. And there's historic examples of this as well. There was actually the first version of the cruise missile was a naval missile that was called an over-the-horizon device. So if you're out at sea and the enemy ships are far enough away that the curvature of the earth creates a mound of water between you, that you can't see them on your radar from your ship, but you're going to launch a missile over the horizon. And then when it gets to the, high enough or far enough, then it'll see that ship that you don't really know exactly where it's at and then home in on that. And they had those missiles from the 1960s. They were never used by any commander of any U.S. ship because nobody ever wanted to take responsibility for whatever it might hit because you literally can't see where it's going. And I think that's a good metaphor for a lot of these, potential risks around autonomous systems. You're launching something and it's supposed to do something. And maybe you've even trained a couple times getting it to do that, but you don't really know what it's going to do. And of course, as they develop more and more sort of concepts of how to use these and try to use them effectively, they're growing in some sort of confidence. But even in Ukraine, they're really only allowing autonomy for these very short periods where human control is ineffective because of the jamming. And they also acknowledge that a human pilot is so much better at controlling these than the automated systems. And I think it's also hinted at in the sort of position that Anthropic has articulated around autonomous weapons, which is that they're not sort of in principle against it, but the technology just isn't there for it to be reliable. And then there's fundamental questions about will AI ever be, fundamentally reliable enough, in particular these models we're looking at with LLMs and hallucinations and things like that.
In July of 2025, right, the US Department of Defense announced that Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, and xAI had each been awarded a $200 million contract to help the government adopt AI. So I think for most people, this actually means that the companies that are making their AI chatbots, Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, those are the same companies that could be vying to potentially power killer robots. I wanted to see if you could help me understand how these two realities can coexist, right? Because I think on one side, it feels like, hey, are AI chatbots a proof of concept to earn Department of Defense contracts, or are Department of Defense contracts used to fund chatbots? Like, I don't understand how those two things coexist right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and I've been learning more as I hear all the journalistic reports of this debate or conflict between Anthropic and the Pentagon of exactly how they're using some of these, right? I mean, it seems that Anthropic's own employees were surprised that their Claude product was used to plan some aspects of the Maduro raid in Venezuela. And they asked some questions to Palantir, who makes this Project Maven system that incorporates this chatbot and Claude in some form, right? So there are these different kinds of AIs, right? And autonomy is related to, but not identical to AI. What we're mostly concerned about is who and how are weapons being controlled, and ensuring that humans are always deciding, what are lawful targets, and that the humans are always held responsible and accountable for choosing those targets. Even if you're using autonomy to navigate or reach a target or intercept a barrage of missiles coming at you, that this is done in a way that there is human responsibility and fundamentally meaningful human control over these systems. Versus, okay, there's ways of using AI to do that. There's also ways of just using, simple algorithms that look at a radar signature, and anything that looks like a missile gets intercepted, and it's not really using what we think of as AI or neural networks or some kind of machine learning. There's a whole, of course, variety of different things that count as AI technology. Most people, I think, in the public are thinking about chatbots, large language models, these foundation models like Anthropic's Claude or ChatGPT or others. And I think the way the contracting process is working at the Pentagon is the Pentagon is essentially the largest and best funded bureaucracy in the world, right? The number of employees and its budget is bigger than any corporation. And they have a lot of employees, and they have a lot of business work to do, right? And the way I think all businesses are integrating these systems at the moment is into workflows of like, okay, we have a task to do, and like, how can we use chatbots to make that more efficient? And so these contracts that you're referring to are a group of government contracts within the Pentagon's budget that says, hey, let's make these available to all of our employees to do their jobs. Now, most of the employees of the Pentagon are not doing what they call classified work, right? This is just, if you've got to get I don't know, fuel for cars and rent apartments. And, there's all sorts of business that goes on
Hmm.
that's not
Hmm.
classified. But only certain systems can get certified to work on classified data. And they have to pass, strict kind of security protocols and things like that. And as far as we can tell, only Claude has been authorized at this time for use on those classified systems. So when you're, hunting down Maduro or the Ayatollah using these huge data sets of classified data, the only one you can use is Claude. There are now contracts for both xAI's Grok and OpenAI's ChatGPT to become certified, and that process could take quite a while. And what we also know is the removal of Claude is supposed to happen over 6 months because they're actively depending on it, which also sort of contradicts the logic of their argument that this company represents a massive national security threat. But at the same time, we're too dependent on it for our current conflict to actually stop using it. And that's pretty much what they say in the lawsuit that Anthropic has placed against the Pentagon. And then that's just sort of the way people use it. Like, okay, help me find this. How do I do this? Make this chart for me, right? So it's just sort of doing banal things. But as you move into that classified data, and it's not clear which of these two red lines, the use of this technology for mass domestic surveillance or the
Hmm.
development of
Hmm.
autonomous weapons, was at issue, or if either of those were actually at issue in the kind of application. I could also envision, however, the ways in which these systems could be used to develop autonomous weapons. And most clearly, the way that they're already being described to be used in Iran is to develop targets that are then bombed. And so there's a lot of questions about to what degree was it used in the targeting of the girls' school in Manab that left so many children dead. It seems the initial reports are that there was old data and at some point that school had been inside of the military base, but more than a decade ago, the wall around the base was moved and that school was outside of it and it became a school. So more recent data would show you that it's not a military base. The US has a long and storied history of bombing things because they were using old maps. Most
Yeah.
famously, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1998 or 99, because it had moved and the targeting people had used a map that showed it in a different location. And they thought that that location was a munitions stockpile, or at least that was the official report. So that happens. There was famously the Qamishiyya location in Iraq that they identified as a regular munitions dump and ordered the ordnance disposal people to blow up all of the munitions there, when it was in fact in all of the databases under a different name as a chemical weapons dump. And so when they blew up those chemical weapons, the chemicals went all over US forces who were in a nearby base. And there were a lot of health issues and lawsuits that sort of followed from that. Clearly not an intentional thing, but databases aren't always right, right? Data is flawed. And if you just have systems that automatically process the data and you don't scrutinize, review that data to check it against current satellite imagery or things, then it could be very easy to miss that because the world is not static. And could humans have made that error? Sure. Did they?
Hmm.
Maybe. Did the AI make it? Probably. But did the humans check that AI? And then, what does this mean when we sort of scale it up? And there's a whole set of concerns, I think, around what it means for proliferating the number of targets that you can attack in a short period of time, which means if you make a bad decision to go to war, you do a lot more destruction before you're able to change course. And a lot of that destruction, I think what we're seeing in the current conflict might lead you to a point where you've eliminated more exit strategies. So that makes it harder to de-escalate, or it makes it harder to achieve your strategic goals of winning the hearts and minds of the population and overthrowing the regime and all of these other things, because you've blown up schools and you've destroyed cultural heritage sites and
Hmm.
so forth. So This mass proliferation of targets, it just accelerates the speed of destruction and the intensity of destruction of warfare. And it doesn't necessarily give you any kind of military or political advantage if you're looking at it in a strategic light. So I think that's a certain kind of problem. And then when it comes to actual autonomous weapons, you sort of move from just systems that are doing decision support, searching for potential targets, nominating, target lists, to kind of automating that to the next step of, well, just have the system find the targets and just go after the targets automatically. Right. And that's when you move into the autonomous weapons phase, where you just automatically are launching attacks based on generated targeting lists. And there is no kind of human oversight and supervision. And that's what we're ultimately the most afraid of, because that will further speed up that loop of destruction, but also eliminate any hope of kind of human review and human control, even over the direction of military strategy and tactics and goals and reaching a political outcome from conflict, which I think is a kind of fundamental fear we should all have. But in terms of, if you think about what Claude AI does, and particularly things like Claude Code, which is generating code and is now kind of the benchmark for a lot of software development. And you start thinking, well, go back to those drones in Ukraine. And if we want to speed up our software development cycle of these new technologies, why aren't we using Claude Code? Like, is Claude Code being used by either the military or these contractors to develop the code for the next generation of autonomous drones? And are those things that, violate Anthropic's code of conduct or contracts? And how do you start thinking about those sorts of issues, I think, is a whole nother field.
I wanted to follow up on something you were saying here, right? That the US, look, we have mistakenly hit targets before. You mentioned the Chinese embassy in Belgrade back in like 1998 or 1999, the Qamishiyya in Iraq. And it reminded me of how you said, when it comes to the debate about actually deploying autonomous weapons, the military is saying, oh, maybe let's hold off the whole over the horizon problem of that missile that we don't know where it's going to go. The question I have here is, when I hear of those mistakes, because I'm on the outside, and I go, that's a pattern of negligence. this military doesn't care at all. And then what I'm hearing actually is, oh, the military is actually very cautious. And maybe it's because I don't know the consequences that came out of those mistakes. So what I'm asking is, how do those two realities coexist?
When you look at professional militaries and officers and soldiers, like, they're very much aware of their role in society and the dangerous nature of the work that they do. And they're the least likely to be wanting to go to war, in my experience. I was even just reading an interview with McChrystal, who was the one-time director of Special Forces operations in Iraq, who kind of said the same thing about this Anthropic thing that I've thought for a long time, which is, if you look at what these officers are doing when they're doing intelligence planning and analysis and, taking intelligence and turning that into a plan of, like, where do we put our defenses, where are we going to attack, and things like that. There's a lot of communication that happens between a lot of smart, dedicated professionals. And they develop ultimately what we call situational awareness. What is happening right now? How do we know what's happening? If we don't know what's happening, how do we, send some other intelligence assets over there to find out what's happening? And then let's come up with a plan. And then if those plans, like every good plan, no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? Everything is going to get revised.
Yeah.
But if you haven't thought about your situation and you haven't talked it out from a lot of different perspectives from a lot of smart people in the room, you're not going to know what to do when things don't go to plan. It's like, okay, we have this plan doesn't work. Oh, now we have to come up with a new plan. If you've outsourced all of that thinking and all of that analysis to an AI, like, where is your ability as a group of commanders and leaders to sort of, okay, now what do we do? How do we even know what's happening? What should we be worried about? Should we be worried that they're going to close down the Strait of Hormuz? You game out all of these possibilities, right? And that's a very social process. And you create a collective understanding of the situation. It's not always correct or 100% correct, but it's also very dynamic and very flexible to changes and uncertainties, where I think when you develop a rigid plan and you don't have any fallback plans and decision points, and you're not thinking about what else might be happening. Wait, what are the counterfactuals? What if we're totally wrong about all of this? What do we do then? And AI kind of seduces you into it. Or outsourcing all of this thinking, makes you very ill prepared for what's going to happen next. I think at that level, like anybody who's been a commander at sort of any level, from the platoon to whole armies or divisions or whatever, understands that process very intimately because you're doing that all of the time. And they understand that value of it to create a shared understanding and a complex, kind of sophisticated understanding of the situation. And what machines don't have, I mean, they collect all this data and it seems, oh, it's got all the data. It understands what's happening. It doesn't understand anything. It associates data points and it will find statistical patterns, but it lacks any understanding. It has no real goals and objectives unless you give it to them. But it can't think like, oh, is this the thing that superficially looks like it's getting me towards my goal, but risks completely undermining my goal? Is that a good thing to do? Is it worth it to take that risk? And without understanding all of the elements of it, you can't really make that kind of risk assessment. And I wouldn't want to ever rely on a machine to make that or to try to pre-code, this is our risk tolerance level. And, you decide for me, like, is this risky or not? They don't have values, right? I mean, you can put numbers on things, but like the value of a human life for a machine, and this is required under international law. It's called proportionality. People call it, collateral damage. But it's if you're striking a military target, that's lawful, but you know that it's next to a school or a hospital and that there will be civilian casualties or very likely will be civilian casualties. Do you make that strike or not? And that's called a proportionality judgment. To make those kinds of judgments, it's fundamentally about values. How much do you value human life? How much do you value the military target that you're trying to destroy? Is that a high enough value target to put any lives at risk, or how many lives at risk? And then can you do it at a time when school's not in session? Can you move things around? And you start to think about the problem in different ways because you have that kind of situational understanding, but also you have values. And the machine just doesn't have those sorts of values. And it's not straightforward to just apply a numeric value to things like that. And so they're not going to make these legal judgments and moral judgments any shape or form like a human does.
All of that leads into my next question here, which is also about Anthropic, right? They were talking about how they didn't want the U.S. Department of Defense to use their technology for fully autonomous weapons. They argued that such weapons, again, quote, need to be deployed with proper guardrails, which don't exist today, end quote. I wanted to just ask and try and escape that framing of like proper guardrails. I just wanted to ask, can fully autonomous weapons be deployed in any way whatsoever that you would consider safe?
I mean, it's partly this distinction of what's a fully autonomous weapon or what do you consider a guardrail? Or, I mean, we've moved in this discussion at the UN even from this, what was the original sort of anything that automatically selects and engages targets, which I think is still correct. But in terms of the legal regulatory structure of it, there's really this, what the ICRC again is calling a two-tiered approach. So there's a category of autonomous weapons that are unconscionable and should be totally illegal and banned. And then there's a category of sort of acceptable systems that should be regulated and tightly regulated, but are acceptable, right? So in that acceptable category, we've already had for many years like missile defense systems that are effectively automatically target engaging. But when you actually hear, the operators of these systems describe how they operate them, like a Patriot missile system. Patriot missile system, it's autonomous for maybe 10 to 30 seconds at a time, where they're like, oh, our radars have picked up incoming missiles, activate the system. There's 3 people standing in the control room of the system, which has already been positioned and designed in a way that right? If an incoming missile falls from the sky, it's not going to fall on buildings. If the missiles that they're launching don't find their target, that they're going to safely self-destruct. And like, there's an immense amount of safety and security that's gone into thinking about how these systems function and operate already. And even then, they were like, yeah, 30 seconds is enough autonomy, no more, right? And you're like, okay, and this is like the sort of most simple, straightforward sort of system, right? But I think that's a valid kind of system. The systems that, of course, you want to ban outright are any kind of systems that are unpredictable in their nature, systems that automatically learn, right? So if you're using machine learning after the system is deployed to sort of learn the enemy or something, it becomes unpredictable over time, right? Any system that can change its fundamental structure, even if you've tested it and evaluated it before, how do you know what it's going to do later? And then we've been pushing for, but have not gotten into the regulations, anti-personnel restrictions that would prohibit the system from directly attacking people. And you sort of talked about face recognition. What they can do and what you see all the time, it's not directly face recognition in terms usually of identifying a specific individual. In most military applications, you don't really know the names and faces of the enemy. You might know their uniform or something like that.
Yeah.
But what they're really doing is identify a human form, running through the forest or across the field or what have you, and just hone in on that, which of course is incredibly dangerous because then you don't really know who it is. And you can try to do analysis and figure out, well, what is the uniform, or what are the patterns of behavior indicating, like, are they from this army or that army, or are they a civilian or are they a combatant? And that's going to be very difficult and, fraught with errors, I think, for a long time. But one of the regulations that we've been really kind of promoting, and is still in there, but it's always sort of slightly evolving, is to restrict the targeting to military objectives or strictly to military objects, which in the world of international law, you have civilian objects, you have military objects, and you have dual use objects, right? If the soldiers take up a position in an apartment building, right, you can target that because they are in the building and it's being used for military purpose. If there's no soldiers there, it's a civilian structure and it would be illegal to target it. But that sort of judgment of, is this a civilian structure that is being used as a military objective, is also a very complex kind of judgment call and often a value call, right? Especially if you know that there's civilians in that building. But even they're using this bridge and the tank is going to cross the bridge. Like, we need to blow up the bridge. Well, the bridge also has all kinds of civilian purposes, and that might be the only way connecting a city to a hospital or something like that. Those sorts of judgments need to be, kicked up to human levels of decision. Like, it's fine for the system to identify it, but to be authorized to attack a civilian structure or civilian, anything that's going to threaten the civilians at that level, like, it needs official human approval. Because again, right, the risks involved, the values involved, the judgments involved, the responsibility that needs to be taken, even though it's a lawful attack, somebody needs to actively take responsibility for that kind of judgment.
I wanted to close out here on something related. I was going to ask, how do we stop killer robots from happening? You were talking about regulations here, restricting to military targets. I wanted to broaden that question out. How do we stop killer robots? But also hone it in a little bit. What can people do at home if they're interested in this? Like, what's their role?
Yeah, we are an international coalition of NGOs. We have 250 organizations representing over 70 different countries. So whatever country you're listening from, if an organization you can get in touch with, or get in touch directly with the campaign to the stopkillerrobots.org website. Donate money. We're
Hell yeah.
We are a scrappy NGO, and we always need funding. And you'd think more of the people in Silicon Valley and the tech industry would be interested in funding us, especially if you're worried about super AI taking over. And don't arm it from the get go. Seems like a good idea. And we're a pretty, broad coalition with a lot of different views, but it's a great place to meet other people, and we're talking about these issues. There's also domestic law issues. There's been initiatives in already, I think in Massachusetts was first, in California, I think Oregon and Washington State are working on basically criminalizing the weaponization of robots. And that, which is, and if you use them in a felony, it's like, it sort of adds a penalty to, strapping a gun onto a robot is already sort of a crime, but making it more criminal and supporting those efforts. And yeah, I mean, there's plenty of petitions and things. And if you're in the tech community and you're working for one of these companies, like there's lots of letters going around that you can sign supporting Anthropic or trying to get your company to adopt these principles. We organized a bunch of letters with scientists back in 2018 when Project Maven first became public knowledge, and Google employees internally were protesting their company working on this thing, which is now doing all the targeting in Iran. And, we were outside academics, but we wrote a letter of support and op-eds in solidarity with their efforts. And, the tech workers haven't always been organized in a way, but these issues have really kind of brought them together. And we're seeing that again here. And I think, that's important because in a lot of cases, they're the ones who both enable the technology, but also understand best how it's used and are able to actually kind of stand up to corporate leadership at a certain level and make some demands, at least, about how their work and labor is being applied. So I think that's crucial. And, you can vote with your feet, right? So, delete ChatGPT and install and Claude on your platforms and modules, which was, actually what happened right after that dispute. Anthropic became the number one AI app, and OpenAI fell off, and so everybody started deleting it.
Anytime we can close an episode saying, "Hey, organize, tech workers, organize." It's you do have power. I realize that we live in a world where the world's trying to remind you that you don't have power, but big changes have been made from employees who organize around these issues and push back. I love any episode like that. So, Peter, thank you again so much for coming on today's show and for telling us all about, let's call them what they are, killer robots.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure.
To our listeners, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe. And remember, you can read all our cybersecurity coverage on Malwarebytes Labs at malwarebytes.com/blog. Finally, our intro music is by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, and our outro music is by Woa from unminus.com. Today's show has been edited by our podcast consultant, Eric Johnson at lightningpod.fm. Thank you, folks.